Here. Hello and welcome everyone to today's ANRA Huddle. Today we're going to talk about remote ID, what it is, why we need it, and what the issues are that the drone industry needs to be aware of as we rapidly approach broad implementation and the final deadline for implementation of remote ID on September 16th. I am Miriam McNabb, editor at dronelife.com, a news site for the commercial drone industry, and I am extremely honored to be moderating this panel of experts who have been at the forefront of developing and implementing remote ID rules. Before we jump into the session, two quick notes. This webinar will be recorded and can be viewed later on the Drone Life YouTube channel. During the last 15 minutes of the session, we will open up for questions at that time. Please ask your question by using the Q&A icon located at the bottom right of your screen. Joining me today are Praveen Raju, Next Gen Program Manager from the FAA. Welcome. Christian Ramsey, Managing Director at UAvionics. Phil Kennel, Chair of the ASTM 38 Committee at the ASTM International, and Amit Ganju, Founder and CEO of ANRA Technologies. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being here. I'd like to jump right in with a question that seems obvious, but really is not. Praveen, you have been a leading voice in the development of so many different programs at the FAA. You have leadership roles at UAS Traffic Management, Advanced Air Mobility, Remote ID, all the three-letter acronyms we've got in the drone industry. You're there. Could you please start us off from the FAA perspective on what remote ID is and why it's important for drone integration, why it's important for the drone industry and commercial drone use?
Thanks, Miriam. Yeah, so remote ID is really the ability of a drone in flight to provide identification and location information, both for the ground station as well as the vehicle itself, right? Within the remote ID rule, we have 7 elements that need to be broadcast, and we'll get into the different ways that things can be broadcast a little bit later today, I believe. But there are 7 data elements, and which are really location information, both for the latitude and longitude of the vehicle as well as the ground control station. That makes up 4 of them. There's an emergency status. There is the serial ID or the serial number of the drone that's registered to it, and an emergency status or the takeoff location. And the takeoff location. So those are some of those elements that make up this broadcast signal. And it's really what we're looking for remote ID to do is it's to lay sort of a foundation for the safety and security of what we need for more complex operations as we move forward. We know there's a lot of visual line of sight operations, but what we are seeing now is a breakthrough for many different pieces that are going to be required for beyond visual line of sight operations going forward. So as we see this breakthrough, we believe remote ID plays a foundational role for that safety and securely integrating these operations into the airspace. This also helps folks like law enforcement, the FAA, and other federal agencies sort of identify and be able to locate drones, especially when they're in off-nominal and unsafe conditions, so we can help folks take the appropriate actions to make the operations more nominal. So that's just a really quick overview of what remote ID is and why we believe is a foundational element for more complex drone operations moving forward.
Okay, so part of that whole framework that needs to happen before we kind of reach the world of, one-to-many drone operations, fully remote, beyond visual line of sight, all of that.
Right, and the last thing we want to do is bother folks that are not that are doing things appropriately, but may not know they're in the wrong types of airspace or don't have the appropriate levels of clearance.
And I mean, in addition, it's not sort of punitive. This is kind of for the legitimate drone industry's benefit, because if you can keep bad actors out or people who don't know what they're doing out. You allow sort of legitimate operations in the space, kind of a
Absolutely.
hotel pass key thing. Let in the people who belong there and keep out the people who don't. Yeah. So, Christian, from your role at Avionics, sorry, you've had the opportunity to really experience remote ID from kind of both sides of the coin. You are both a provider and you're a user of the technology. So Avionics provides a variety of products and services. You provide many of the ecosystem tools that enable advanced drone operations. From your perspective, what are some of the technological challenges with remote ID?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of challenges. There's a really near-term, short-term challenge, which is just availability, right? Everyone has waited until a couple of weeks before the deadline to try to get their hands on remote ID broadcast modules in particular for those platforms that could not be upgraded by the manufacturer. So that's an initial challenge. A second challenge is there's a category that I just mentioned where a lot of commercial manufacturers who produce hundreds or thousands of a particular platform have been able to implement remote ID through firmware upgrades. But there's another category of users who have built their own platforms or using a platform and they integrate their own autopilot and radios and things along the lines of them. And it's a bit harder for them to select the right component and go through the DOC or Declaration of Conformity process with the FAA with kind of a one-off aircraft and selecting those components. So we're having to coach a lot of our customers through that process because it's not that it's not easy, but you have to perform some testing on every single aircraft in those instances in order to approve that single aircraft for remote ID usage. The third challenge is probably a little bit more controversial, but it has to do with the technology and the frequencies that we're selecting, right? So Bluetooth technology, Wi-Fi technology are FCC Part 15 frequencies, meaning that they're really inexpensive to access. Lots of folks produce those frequency chips that can be used in broadcast modules commercially and inexpensively. But it's also a very crowded spectrum. And so depending on how much Bluetooth activity is nearby or Wi-Fi activity is nearby, you could get a lot of interference and really affect the performance of the remote ID solution in a given area, depending on where you're operating. And we've even seen some open source tools that will spoof remote ID targets, and it's frankly not clear if that's even an illegal action given that they're part of CC. So there's really some challenges associated with the technology selection, but I think from a first cut perspective, it's a decent start. It's how we get moving. Phil will probably talk about network remote ID later, and that'll be a future evolution of the progress to help address some of those challenges.
Okay, so we'll dive into some of those a little more deeply later on because it sounds to me like you foresee possibilities that when you are in a national special security event, the Olympics, for example, and a lot of people are using different tools that could be more challenging. So we'll talk about that. So Phil, you are on the standards committee that developed the international standards for remote ID. So you're the chairperson of the ASTM F38 standards. You've been working with stakeholders to determine what those standards should be so that the industry globally can work towards them. First of all, tell us something that you mentioned and I was not aware of, I have to say. Why are there two ASTM standards for remote ID? So there's a standard specification for remote ID and tracking and standard practice for remote ID means of compliance. Sound similar, not exactly the same. Can you dive into that, please?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. When we first started out working on a remote ID standard, it was about the time of the ARC, the remote ID ARC. And then we had the notice of proposed rulemaking came out. And we geared the original standard towards the FAA's requirements for remote identification. However, we wanted this to be a global standard because it was an industry consensus standard, and everybody wants to manufacture their systems to the same standard so they can market them globally. And that was really the intent behind the 3411 standard. The 3411 standard was really geared for international requirements, also included the FAA's requirements as well. With that, we had the standard or
I've lost. Oh, Phil, I lost you just for a second there. You just
Okay.
repeat the last thing you said.
Okay, am I back? Hopefully
You're back.
Yeah.
You're back.
So the F3411 standard has both broadcast and network remote ID, and broadcast is only included in the FAA's current rule for remote identification. And being it's a global standard, we left them both in. And we do eventually think that network will be a requirement in the United States, just because it's a enabling element for UTM as well. So there's global requirements in there, ICAO requirements, European requirements, Japanese requirements in 3411. And when the FAA's final rule came out for remote ID, it was just broadcast. So we developed a means of compliance specifically for the FAA's needs. That's why there are currently two standards for remote ID. The means of compliance standard is really a subset of 3411 that takes out all of the requirements for all the requirements that are required in the United States to fly a drone using remote ID.
Okay, so Amit, I have heard you have explained this to me personally back in the past. So you take this just from a high level for those who are not sort of intimately involved in the nuts and bolts here, network versus broadcast. What can you do with network that you can't do with broadcast?
Sure. I think that's a great question. And I'll use a real world example. So let's look at broadcast remote ID. And Christian mentioned the two technologies like Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. As you can imagine, these technologies have limited range, a few hundred feet, whether you can Bluetooth 5, Wi-Fi may be a little less, and based on the output power. So by the time a law enforcement official or any authorized user pulls out a phone and it picks up the signal and shows you, you have to be, first of all, you have to be within a certain amount of range. The challenge is this kind of stuff works fine if you have like small multi-rotors just flying around in a park doing a roof and top inspection or a mapping. But if you have a fixed wing aircraft or a hybrid aircraft, those aircraft move very fast. So by the time I pull out a phone and look for a broadcast, the aircraft will already be hundreds, if not thousands of feet away. So I may not even pick up. So that's one of the key, amongst other technical challenges that Christian alluded to. So this is very limited to localized VLOS kind of operations where drones are not fast movers, they're not moving very fast. Now, when you transition to more network and true, as we scale operation, move to true BVLOS operations and stuff like that, that's where the network aspects really shines, because all that data is getting ingested into the network via what's called a UAS service supplier. And via a federated model, it can be available via display clients to different people. So at that point, it doesn't really matter where the person who's trying to look up the drone is. They could be halfway across the country. As long as they know the location where on the map where they want to see, the information will be available. And it doesn't matter if the drone has flown away, because you kind of know which direction it was. You can broaden your search area and see, as long as you're authorized to do that, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So, and then there, the other aspect is a lot of people, and Phil kind of touched on that. A lot of people just talk about broadcast or network. Honestly, in the long term, I personally believe it has to be a combination of both that will really enable operations at scale. Because if you're out there in the middle of nowhere where there's no network availability, obviously network-based remote ID may not work. In Europe, like right now, there are some countries which have ubiquitous cellular coverage. So they're going with network out of the box. In US, we are starting a baby step with remote ID, but I believe going forward, it'll be a combination. And there are some other research initiatives within FAA, which even we are involved in, where we are experimenting how to bring the best of the two worlds to bear.
Okay, so maybe for the future. Praveen, there's one thing that I wanted to make sure that we kind of clarified for people, because certainly from my perspective, where I see a lot of communication from people who are stakeholders in the industry, but maybe not sort of in the weeds, so to speak. Who can get access to the information about where the commercial drone is? So I'm a commercial pilot. I'm working on a construction site. And I'm equipped with a remote ID. Who can see where I am and who I am, or what my registration number is?
Yeah, so that information, those data elements that I had initially mentioned, that's publicly available to anybody, right? We treat this really like a license plate number, right? And that ID and that broadcast information, as long as you have access to an application, that information is there for you to be able to report to the appropriate authorities on whatever your concerns are. Now, using that information, the FAA and other agencies hold things like registration information on individuals that registered to a certain aircraft. Now, if you want to correlate that information from the remote ID received from the vehicle or the broadcast module to that information that's inherently held within the FAA, that requires an elevated level of privileges and through the appropriate channels before you have access to that information. Those we have established policies for within the FAA and the federal government in order to access that information. And it really needs to be for things like accident investigation or for some potential flyaway incidents or whatever they may be. Right. And so there has to be a legitimate need for that information. You need to have the appropriate level of access, which all gets tied into the back end of a lot of our development with a lot of very significant cybersecurity protocols for that FAA held information. But the broadcast information that is being broadcast or displayed off of the drone itself or through that module is available to anybody with access to an application. And there are several entities and companies that have developed applications. I mean, one of them, ANRA Technologies, that are available or will be available very soon for the general public as well as any other consumers that want access to it.
So, but this is truly like a license plate where I can see someone speeding through an intersection, take down their license plate and report it, but I would have no way of being able to say that particular car belongs to this particular person. So for people who do have privacy concerns, it is exactly the same as if you were able to visually see someone's registration number or license plate and reported appropriately.
That's the intention. It's the rule is about an identification rule, right? So we can start to safely integrate these drones into the airspace system.
Okay. Christian, what do you hear from your clients and customers about what their sort of concerns about remote ID are? You mentioned, of course, if you are a sort of vertical specific, use case specific, a little more unique aircraft, it may be more difficult to meet the standard. What else are you hearing?
Yeah, I mean, there's some, we have, as you can imagine, we have clients that are commercial operators, clients that are hobbyists that fly RC aircraft, clients that are government operators. And they all have very, very different needs and use cases in terms of how to comply, what to comply with. From the RC aircraft perspective, they can fly under what's called a FRIA, which is a pre-designated remote ID free zone, right? Where they can, if that zone gets designated, they can fly without any technology on board at all, or they can fly with what's called a broadcast module. Broadcast modules are basically a stick-on device that does not have any sort of close integration with the aircraft itself. And that's one of the products that we produce is a broadcast module. You literally Velcro it on and power it up, and it gives gives you broadcast module remote ID capability. That comes with operational limitations, right? There's a visual line of sight operational limitation for broadcast modules. There are government clients who are commercial clients that do want to fly beyond visual line of sight, and they need the standard remote ID capability. And that is a system that gets a bit more integrated into the aircraft. There's a little more information, and it requires the ability to obtain the GPS location of the operator, which may not be something that the ground control station is equipped with. How does the GPS information of the operator get from the ground control station through the command and control link into the flight computer, from the flight computer to the standard remote ID? That integration is not always simple to get. And then there's a requirement for tamper proofness, right? You can't remove it. You can't turn it off. You have to have a self check, and it's supposed to not be able to take off if the broadcast remote ID is working. So there's some complexity in the implementation of standard remote ID that is for some users, it's not an out of the box solution, and they're looking for engineering integration efforts in order to make that a usable case. And unfortunately, I think that those clients are the most likely to fly BVLOS today in terms of providing commercial operations, because they're not necessarily flying beyond visual line of sight with a DJI or a Skydio, with the exception of shielded ops and things like that. But you're talking about longer range flights, and those aircraft that are more complex take a lot more complexity in terms of integration and compliance and improving compliance. So there's several different layers there associated with that. And then there are the government customers who, the rule allows them the ability to exempt a solution, right? To be exempt from having remote ID if they're a government operator. But if you built in a tamper-proof system into an off-the-shelf drone, and you're not supposed to be able to turn it off, how do those government customers turn that off, right? So there's a lot of little details that we're hearing from all sorts, that whole spectrum of users, from the RC flyers to the complex ops.
So we may end up with different solutions for somebody like a government user versus a commercial user, one which allows you to disable or one which doesn't. Yeah. I'm always struck by the age of the fleet. So when we look at the FAA reports on the fleet and the registered drones, you often see that like the beloved 3D Solo is still out there, and that's going to be very challenging to retrofit.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think, Miriam, if I could add in a couple things there. I think what Christian said on the FRIAs, or the federally recognized identification areas, is a really important point. And to your point on the fleets and the aging sets of aircraft, as well as new ones coming online, right? We want it to be very much so inclusionary as part of this rulemaking. And this rule, as it was published, that hobbyists and folks that do have these aging aircraft that may not necessarily want to upgrade have locations and areas where they can operate without remote ID. So these FRIAs are that solution for folks that want to fly and operate without having to broadcast. They're publicly available on our website, and folks can access them on the FAA website. And that gives them locations where you don't have to equip, right? And you don't have to go buy a broadcast module for a hobbyist, and you can just go and fly in these areas. And I think that's a very important piece of information for folks to have, that not everybody does need to buy, as long as you operate in the appropriate locations.
For recreational flyers.
For recreational flyers.
And let's face it, that's actually a really important part of our industry, because the 12-year-old who gets really interested in recreational flying is possibly a future engineer or drone pilot. So,
yep.
Okay, absolutely. Phil, let's talk about the standard as it applies not just here in the U.S., but internationally and globally. And again, we've talked about this, but most drone manufacturers really would like to be able to serve a global audience. Are they going to be able to do that by meeting the FAA standards? How is it being sort of implemented around the world?
Well, as I mentioned before, we scoped the standard to be international in nature while also satisfying all the FAA requirements. And one of the first adopters of the standards was actually in Europe for the open category of drones as well. And that's the lowest, simplest, lowest risk category of drone as well. But they've also recently, in their their equivalent of a notice of proposed rule for U-Space or UTM in Europe, they identified network remote ID as a requirement as one of the mandatory services that are going to be required for U-Space in Europe. So I think that's a good example of the fact that this standard can and is international in nature. The government of Japan has also implemented the ASTM remote ID standard as a means to satisfy their requirements for remote ID. I've also, during my time up at ICAO, working at ICAO, I've also met several other developing nations and other countries that are also looking at the standard to implement it as a requirement to meet their regulations and have already implemented as a requirement to meet their regulations. So I think the industry as a whole, all the participants, the industry partners, I think this was a big success for standardization for UAS, as remote ID was really one of the first standards recognized as a means of compliance by the FAA and actually implemented globally as well. So what I am waiting for is the next step in how, and we've mentioned it a little bit before about how network remote ID is going to be implemented globally as well.
Okay, interesting to see. So if manufacturers are developing to that global standard, perhaps eventually when the FAA adds that to the protocol here, they'll be ready to go, perhaps.
We would hope so, and that's something Christian might be able to address a little bit better, being that he actually manufactures a lot of the widgets that are going into remote ID.
Okay, let's get a little more into the nitty-gritty, if you will. Sort of, Praveen, you mentioned, there are kind of data points, and I wanted to talk. I wanted to ask Amit to kind of give us a little bit of an overview from your perspective, providing things like Mission Manager, which is a kind of practical tool for managing a fleet on a large commercial operation. How does remote ID impact sort of the day-to-day operations of an industrial or commercial fleet? You're at the power authority, you're at a mine, you're in a big construction company. How is this affecting your day-to-day work? Assuming that you are using remote ID compliant aircraft. So we'll start from there. Let's say you are using, a remote ID enabled aircraft. You've met is there any impact on your day-to-day work? Can this make life better for you? Or is it simply that you are helping to move the framework forward towards better UTM? Amit, I think you're muted.
Can you hear me?
One of us had to do that.
No, I think, Miriam, that's a great question. And honestly, I think it's more of the latter, actually, because remote ID for good actors is just nice to have, because it doesn't really do anything for the good actors. Because if I'm operating a mining operation, a utility inspection and stuff, I am more than likely complying with all the rules and regulations. So the remote ID is if you're operating in an area, say critical infrastructure area, and you're flying 2 drones out there, but all of a sudden in the sky you see 3 drones. Now 2 of them are mine. The third one you don't know. That's where having remote ID is. Hey, can I ID this? And then first of all, can I ID it? If it doesn't show up, that means it's not even compliant with the remote ID rule, and it shouldn't be there in the first place. And if it is, and if I have concern, if you report it to a law enforcement official, the law enforcement official, based on that, could look up the additional details and what Praveen talked about earlier, like a correlation query. So they could go back, an authorized user can go back into the potential FAA database and pull up additional details about the operator, their name, address, etc., etc., etc. what, from our solution point of view, our app, and Praveen alluded to us earlier, already includes broadcast remote ID detection. So if the pilots in the field, enterprise users that are using our application, all of a sudden see something that they don't feel should be there and want to ID, they can just click an icon in the app and it will look for all broadcasts in the area and show them exactly what is where. And then they can distinguish between their assets and if they see something, then they can take action and notify the law enforcement and other users. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Yes. So if you are in compliance, you're operating, it's business as usual. This is providing you with extra security from interference around you, and maybe helping because I think in some instances people still suffer from people who aren't familiar with drones saying what's going on, why are you there, what are you doing, and this is a way of, hey, I'm legitimate, I got nothing to worry about. So that's great.
I did want to, if I may have a go back, I did want to go back to the aspect, because as you transition, as things move towards more network-based, actually the impact to the OEMs and the drone manufacturers is lighter, because they don't have to worry about all this hardware integration, because in the case of network in line with the standard, that data can come from the GCS or directly from the aircraft, as long as we have that identifying information and the live track information coming in. So it's a much lighter lift from an OEM point of view as well.
Okay. So Christian, actually, let's continue that to say, what we were discussing with Phil. If you are a global manufacturer and you've already met the requirements for remote ID here in the US, is it going to be easier to meet, so to sort of add on the network requirements that are required around the world? Is UAvionics producing a solution appropriate for the global remote ID, or?
We're not yet. No, I mean it's a different technology.
It's stack. A different okay, so it's not just as simple as you can kind of.
Yeah, I mean, as an avionics or aviation manufacturer, you tend to, the two big markets are North America. Usually Canada and US are pretty well aligned, and Europe, right? And so you want to see what Europe's going to do from a market perspective. The rest of the world generally will fall in line with one of those two major standards. So we're waiting to see, what the final outcome is before we proceed with a manufacturing of different types of modules to see what the rules are. I did want to go back to your previous question real quick. I have heard the flip side regarding I have heard operators say, since standard remote ID is telling the world where I am physically located, there is the potential for folks to seek them out more directly, whereas they may not know where that operator is operating from previously. So I have heard some concerns. I've not heard any anecdotal evidence of that actually happening, but I have heard some concerns that from operators saying, people, some folks don't like us operating anyway, and now you're telling them exactly where I am. And so I have seen or heard of concerns from that perspective.
Right. I guess from the flip side, you've got the infamous Gatwick incident where they had to look for those operators for days and days, and it cost Lord only knows how much money to figure that out. So yeah. Okay. Yeah. Praveen, let's go a little bit deeper, if you could. You mentioned in your answer to the first question, you said, okay, we'll look at that a little more later. So what are the data points? Go a little deeper into what the data points that remote ID is looking for from your aircraft, so people can sort of thoroughly understand exactly what's being broadcast about their flight.
Yeah, so I'll mention a couple of things, right? So there's a latitude and longitude of the aircraft itself, right? And then there's a serial number or an N number in traditional aircraft, but here we call it a serial number. It's a electronically broadcast number that's tied to that to that vehicle, which is ultimately tied back to the registration database, right, that we hold on to, as well as some of the ground control information. And then there's some emergency status and takeoff location information of that vehicle, right? And that's really the foundation of what the various data elements that are being broadcast are. Now, when we start looking at broadcast, there's a few different ways that people can broadcast, right? We know that there's new vehicles that are being produced on a daily basis. And in that, they are integrating the signal to be broadcast through the chipsets and the mechanisms that are already on board. Now, there are already aircraft that exist today that will need to adhere to the rule, and that rule is coming to full fruition on September 16th currently, right? And so in order to comply with that, and if you already own an aircraft that doesn't have those chipsets that are easy enough to update, or the manufacturer is not updating those, right? Or you've built one yourself, or one of many things, right? And you want to operate in the nominal environment, you may need to have a broadcast module, which is what Christian was alluding to, which does the exact same thing, except it can go on to the drone through Velcro, or one of many mechanisms I've seen through testing, right? And the last is the areas that you don't need to broadcast, right? And those areas you don't need that necessary requirement to be on. Even if it's available, you don't need to have it on, but it's always good to have it on in all of these environments. Now, where we see, I talked about this being a foundational piece especially for security, right? We're in the FAA. We're always doing a lot of R&D, and we're working with innovative companies like the ones that are on the panel here today, but several others as well. And some of those include the folks that are looking at doing detection, right? Non-cooperative detection. And what Remote ID does is really filter out those that are cooperative, right? The non-cooperative or detection equipment really starts to take a look at the picture, more of a radar type of thing that requires heavy equipage. And where we're seeing the demand for this, or where the industry is showing us demand for it, I should say, is that around critical infrastructure, right? And protected infrastructure. Things like airports, or government facilities, or military bases, or one of many, right? I'm just giving a few examples here. But those areas really start to have a need or a want for some of these non-cooperative things, detection capabilities. Now, when you overlay that with Remote ID information, you're really able to discern a lot of the cooperative folks, and you also start to be able to discern those that are cooperative and they may just be clueless, right? Furthermore, then you start to get a very narrow scope of folks that may be there and not be cooperative, and not want folks to know what their operations look like. And those, the appropriate entities can take the appropriate actions based off that information. So that integration, the next steps, what we're seeing is that integration between non-cooperative detection equipment and Remote ID broadcast information, or Remote ID information, I should say, right? Whether it be through broadcast or any other mechanisms, that Remote ID information becomes a lot more critical, right? And for that audience, and that creates an additional level of sophistication and an additional level of layer and situational awareness for those airport managers, for those law enforcement entities, for the security personnel, right? And so that's where the complexity starts to increase to the next level as well.
So that's what Amit was talking about, where you're flying, two of them are yours, you're Delta Airlines, and you are starting to do maintenance inspections by drone on the runway. You've got 2 drones in the air. So that one absolutely doesn't belong, and they need to go out. So yeah, okay. And I really do believe that is going to help as that sort of gets more common. Everyone will have more comfort about seeing drones in the air, knowing that they are legitimate. So Christian and Ahmed, in pre-show, we sort of addressed this. You did mention it briefly. I do just want to talk about this issue of spoofing, whether you know, good, bad, indifferent, whether it's a reality. Could you just explain what that is? Because it is a concern that I've heard expressed.
Christian, you want to go first?
So the idea of spoofing is that you broadcast a signal that communicates there's a drone in the airspace when there isn't, or that the signal is indicating that the drone is somewhere other than where it is, right? So you're producing false information into the airspace. That's a risk because it complicates the security and the identification if what you're looking at isn't real from an app perspective or from a identification perspective. If you don't know that's a real target, that's a real drone, right? You may find someone may spoof the airspace with hundreds of false targets, but there's one in there that's real, that's nefarious, right? I mean, so there are means to really confuse the issue through spoofing. And given that we have selected technologies that are not protected from a spectrum perspective, there's not quite a legal prohibition on using those frequencies for those purposes, right? Or it's a little gray at least, right, in terms of what it is. And given that those same signals are used by your garage door opener or your wireless phone or your garage, whatever, right? They're all using the same little frequencies. You can get some interference, right? And so that could interfere with the signal or the reception of the signal. And so there's I'm just curious to see if we're going to foresee or see any future spoofing events and how they will be enforced, given that the FCC Part 15. FCC Part 15 is meant to be very open and accessible technologies, and there is a statement if you're going to use FCC Part 15 technologies that you are not to produce interfering information, right? And so there is kind of a gray line there, but there's someone could put a remote ID on your dog's collar and send the dog running around, right? I mean, there's nothing that prevents this to be only used by aviation. Right now, it's intended for use by aviation, but there's nothing that says you can't put it on your dog's collar, right? So it's there's just a little bit of an open gray area here in terms of what things could be done to confuse enforcement.
I'll just pull the thread a little bit more. So I've always been a firm believer, even in the past, given the background I come from, it's like anytime you introduce new technologies, new requirements, regulations like that, these are for the good actors. You really can't prevent a bad actor because a bad actor is not going to use the RID in the first place.
We're all nodding here. Absolutely. You're right.
They are going to cause disruptions and stuff like that. And what Christian mentioned, like even in my house, may have Wi-Fi signals interfering with each other because we have multiple. So there are issues and challenges. It's that crawl, walk, run methodology. We want to get something out there to see how it works and then keep in an iterative fashion. I don't think this is something set in stone. There are gaps. I completely agree with Christian, like spoofing and injecting spurious information into the environment. Now, the other thing is for someone to do that, they have to be locally in the area where this is happening. So it's not like I can do this from across the country. So those are some of the other factors that you have to account. But going forward, do we want to look at protected spectrum? So it's not Part 15 per se. And those are some of the things I think that will come up as this thing starts getting rolled out. And then there are certain ways to secure some of these broadcasts as well, but that will require modifications to the technology, to the standard, and increases the cost too, because I think one of the other things we have to factor is what is the additional cost this whole thing is going to incur to the end consumer. Is it something simple, or is it something that's very complex and elaborate and changes the cost of the drone from $500 to $1,000, right? Those are some of the aspects, give and take, so cost benefit analysis we have to look at.
And to clarify, you're right. Lots of technologies can be spoofed. So this is nothing really unique about remote ID that makes it a spoofable technology. In fact, ADSB is an aviation technology that has a risk of spoofing, right? The difference is that ADSB operates on a protected spectrum, and there's a much larger legal penalty for that spoof than something on a Part 15 technology. So it's really not about the technological capability to spoof something. It's the enforcement action associated with being able to spoof that with someone that does that.
Yeah. And I think we'll have to see, because we've seen a lot of laws, that it's not necessary to say don't spy on somebody with a drone, because it's already illegal to spy on someone. So, it's maybe illegal to interfere with or whatever the purpose of the spoof was. So that may all work itself out. We are opening the Q&A now. So just quickly before we get to some of the questions, could we talk a little bit about, I'd like each of you to sort of say from your perspective, what do people need right now just to make sure that they are ready for September 16th? So Praveen, if we could just start with you, and your answer may be, the subsequent people may say, yeah, same, that's it. But what do you think people need to be sure that they've thought of before 3 weeks from now?
Yeah, I think there, instead of me going off the top of my mind, we have a really valuable resource on the FAA.gov website on remote ID. We have a few just informational videos of what is remote ID, what does it look like, and we captured this through activities that we've worked with a lot of the industry players here, and through R&D, and we've developed it into a very informative and educational video. We also have, we've talked about the various ways you can be in compliance, and we talk about that a lot more in depth and on paper of what compliance looks like, what the data elements are, in a very simple and digestible manner on that website as well. So I would encourage everybody, if you had any questions on what compliance looks like, what it means, and why, to go to the FAA.gov website and just even do a quick Google search and just say, hey, FAA remote ID. And it should be your first search result. And it's a really valuable resource. And we're always out there as representatives from the FAA to help folks come understand and come up to speed on this. So if you have any questions, please don't feel free to reach out to me, and don't hesitate to reach out to a lot of my colleagues that are here to help facilitate and help folks understand what remote ID means and what it looks to enable.
Yeah, I actually will comment too. Over the last couple of years, the FAA has beefed out their informational section on drones dramatically. There's a lot of great information. Should be sort of first stop for most people. Christian.
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is, if there's a size limitation, right? So if you've got a drone that is under 249 grams, you don't need to do anything at all, right? If you've got a drone that is over 249 grams and it's made by a kind of a name brand company, more than likely all you have to do is make sure you're on the latest firmware version, and they probably address the issue for you. So I would, take a look at that and, make sure you're updated and check with the manufacturer. And you're, probably more than 80% of manufacturers have already provided a solution for you for that. The next easiest thing to do, assuming you're not flying in FRIA, is get a broadcast module, and there are probably a dozen or so manufacturers that make broadcast modules that are accepted by the FAA. That is a key point, whereas FAA has to approve what's called a declaration of conformity for broadcast modules and for the aircraft themselves. There are manufacturers out there that are selling products that are not. They'll say they meet the standard, but they've not gone through the process with the FAA. So you want to check and make sure you're legal with a broadcast module. That is.
And there is an FAA list. Am I correct? I apologize for interrupting, but is there not a list on the FAA website of approved providers?
I believe so. Yeah, it's not the easiest thing to navigate, but I believe it's on the FAA Drone Zone's website. But it's there could be a more easy to find list.
Okay.
For OPI. So I think those are the easiest steps. If you're in a category where you've got a more complex aircraft and you're going to fly BVLOS, then you're in a more of an engineering project to be prepared for that. But most likely you're either already compliant, you didn't know it, or you just need a broadcast module.
All right. Amit, anything to add to that? What people need to do to get ready?
Actually, Christian captured it very well. I actually do have a question. I'm going to put Praveen on the spot here and ask him. A couple of us were in the ACT meeting yesterday, and one of the questions that came up was the September 16th deadline. And is this set in stone? And are there any, given that the industry and the general public in overall may not be ready for this date, is there a possibility that this date may actually be, there may be a new grace period, or is September 16th the way we know set in stone?
So, I'll speak for me. I come from the R&D organization, so I can't really say one way or the other. But right now, September 16th is the full compliance date. Now, we know that there have been some challenges on many fronts, right? And we've received that input to the agency. And there are folks in our flight standards office and our office that really oversees the policy and policy development and implementation that are looking into that. So you will hear more back based off of the feedback through the AAAC, as well as what we've heard back at the UAS symposium a few weeks ago as well.
Okay. Phil, anything you want to add to what people need to do to be ready?
Yeah. Just to follow up on what Christian said and Praveen, I think for the recreational user, for the operator, it's pretty simple to comply with the regulation. I mean, if you have a legacy platform, you put a module on. A lot of the manufacturers are building right now to meet the requirements. And what Amit and Praveen mentioned was maybe not everybody's ready. I'm expecting a little bit of a light touch from the FAA on the non-compliant in the interim. But one of the things that we found, our working group and the subject matter experts on the working group who developed the standard based on the architects of remote ID have been getting a lot of questions internationally, and that is companies who want to manufacture to meet the requirements in the United States, they're not quite sure how to do that yet. So we're trying to walk them through, and what we decided to do, we're going to roll out an e-learning curriculum based on the means of compliance to meet FAA requirements. And that's something that we had just started just because we started getting a lot of questions internationally. The manufacturers want to know how they can build to be compliant, how they can meet the requirements of the Declaration of Compliance. So we're starting to work on a how-to. And we're going to get in touch with Praveen and the FAA just to make sure that we're not stepping on any toes, and to make sure that we're in sync with what the FAA wants. Great.
All right, I'm going to get to some of these questions. We have a long list here. Panelists, if you could give me sort of a visual signal that you would like to answer the question, put your hand up. That would be helpful. So first question, who is providing the mobile apps to read BRID signals? Are they free? Go for it, Amit.
So I think there'll be multiple sources for it. For us, because we cater to enterprises, we don't necessarily cater to recreational market. So all our enterprise solutions have this capability already built into our app. So there's no additional thing, and there's no additional cost we charge our enterprise users. Now, will we maybe make a free version of that available down the line? It's quite possible. There are some basic open source versions out there too, which people can potentially, they're not necessarily supported, it's open source, so they might be available out there freely as well.
Okay. This one is, what research will be conducted to assess the effectiveness of broadcast RID in the 2.4 gigahertz band in environments with a lot of interference, whether from other RID senders or other users of the band? Do we have any insight on that? I would think that actually, as they do trials, like I just published a piece yesterday, Pierce Aerospace put their RID modules. They were actually at the Super Bowl, so 70-some thousand people in a stadium. So I think there are a lot of those real world tests of what happens when you are in, that kind of a very crowded environment. Okay, but we don't have any official work going on right now that we know about. Here's an interesting one. Does local law enforcement need to be trained or educated on how they do that? So for example, I see a drone is harassing me. I have a BRID signal or something. I call the police and I say, hey, this drone is breaking the law in some way, shape, or form. What happens then? Who is enforcing this? Would local law enforcement then contact the FAA to get a request for that? And is there training ongoing for local law enforcement?
So I guess I'll answer as much as I can, right? FAA is not an enforcement agency in that term, right? In that statute. So that question is best answered by folks in that community. What we are about is enabling the rule to make sure identification is done properly, and those that are following the rules and regulations of the road aren't mistaken for the other actors. So the enforcement and training and all of that is really on each agency or on law enforcement entity. And there are rules, and they still have to follow all their regulations as they would normally. So.
Right.
Mary, if I can add to that, it's like from a real world experience, we've had some projects that we recently had final demonstrations for where law enforcement was invited, and they came in, and these were remote ID related, both network and broadcast, but they all loved what they saw, but the challenge is they didn't know anything about it. So the lack of education is definitely going to be a problem. There are some law enforcement agencies that are already using drones, so they are more proactive. They are kind of familiar with what's coming down the pipe, but majority of them, I don't think are. And so that is definitely a gap.
Yeah, I don't think there's historically much of an interaction between local law enforcement and FAA. This would be sort of new pathways to blaze here.
All right. Well, I just have one more here that I'm going to answer before we wrap up. And that is about how many broadcast modules that are FAA accepted are currently available for purchase right now. Any idea on that? Is it sort of 10 compliant modules, or Phil?
Well, I don't know about the number, but I have talked to some manufacturers, and they've been selling out. The ones that have been approved have been selling out fairly quickly. And I think there's still some catch up with supply issues and logistics. So the folks that I talk to, they're building them and they're selling them as fast as they can make them.
Okay, great. Well,
I'll say that's true for us as well. Our modules, it's the same situation, but it did not start until about a month ago. Right. I mean, everyone waited until there was a month to go before, compliance date. And then everyone decided to order them.
Is this really happening? Is this really happening? Right. It's really happening. Okay. Great. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for being here today. This has been a great topic, and certainly something of very pertinent interest to our industry. Thank you for all of your knowledge and willingness to share that with us. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Again, this recording will end, and it will be available at a later date on the Drone Life YouTube website. Thanks again.
Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you.